X-Files.
Tom Hanks, great to be with you. What's interesting to me is how do you become Tom Hanks? How does Tom Hanks become Tom Hanks? Because I did a little reading about your life. I mean, people look at you, you're warm, you're garrulous, you're kind of an American icon, and they say, well, he must have grown up with Ward and June Cleaver. I mean, he must be like with Wally and the Beaver. Your childhood wasn't like that.
No, my parents, the joke is they pioneered the marriage dissolution laws for the state of California, you know. It's my dad, Janet, Amos, and Zsa Zsa Gabor all had a lot of divorces between them. But I can't, it's funny, well, I have 3 siblings. I'm the 3rd kid of 4. And we all have different takes on, you know, the environment that we grew up in. And mine is that other than it being confusing sometimes, and otherwise it being having parents who weren't anxious to tell us what was going on in the world, I kind of thought it was an adventure. I had 10 different homes by the time I was 10 years old. And I thought
that is confusing.
Yeah, but I thought it was kind of cool. I lived in I had a bunch of step siblings. We lived in apartments. We lived almost like on quasi farms. We lived in the outskirts of town. We lived in the middle of towns.
Different schools?
Yeah. I was able to size up what was going on pretty quick, and some degree of, a good sense of humor and some degree of confidence, and a great amount of adopted independence, I think. If I was going to say there's a problem there, I traveled emotionally light, meaning I didn't take a lot of the burdens of that confusion along with me. It's funny, I lived in one house until I was 14, so 10 to 14, and that was the longest I had lived anywhere. 4 years in one place, and then we started moving again every year.
Yeah, I read somewhere you described yourself in school as a nerd, a spaz, painfully shy.
I was at combat, I think, with the reality of the home environment. Outside for 2.5 years where we sort of lived alone, I was not necessarily anxious to get home, because there was an unspoken tension in the house. There was always something that was not being said, like how long we're going to live there, or how good Dad and his wife are getting along. So I think the combat I had was a liveliness and a distraction that was built on hanging out with other people and staying busy, and sort of like being in the entertainment business without realizing I was in the entertainment business.
Well, when did you realize that you wanted to entertain? When did the acting bug?
I was always a guy who shouted out wisecracks during the slideshow, at school. But when I was in high school and had that, well, what are you going to do? What do you take in high school? Biology, government, world history. What are you going to do? I ran the track team for a while with absolutely no enthusiasm whatsoever. But then when a friend of mine was in the school play, and I saw him do this, and I just said, what's this racket? You're telling me we could come and do this here? I thought it was only for Parks Department stuff, or maybe
yeah.
in the church group you might put on skits and stuff like that. And when I realized it was when I found out there was a classroom that had a stage in it, and you could take more than one class, and it wasn't babysitting.
And what about it particularly? What about acting? I mean, it seems to me, I admire, you're the best of the best, but anyone who can inhabit a character and become someone else.
Well, I was just doing purely on instinct, but the instinct was to throw myself into it totally. When I was in a play or when I was performing, it took up every moment of my day and every brain cell. I think there are people who are actors, and there are people who are not, never will be. I just am one of those that was not self-conscious about it. It was really sort of like champing at the bit in order to go be a part of something.
What about the reaction to it? There must have been some thrill associated with being entertaining people.
Well, there was just the excitement of knowing that anybody had shown up specifically to watch what you are in. But I also had the same exact thrill of when I was a stage manager of the shows, because we were a part of this magic thing that was hidden from them, but you could hear them, you could feel the heat of an audience, you could actually feel the focus of their eyeballs on you, and if they started reacting in a way to something that you were doing, well, that's just, David, that's crack cocaine, it's crack cocaine.
Did you, and you must have found a community then with people who you were acting with, working with, crews, and
I would say I found it. I found the tribe that I think every person needs to belong to, that every person needs to seek out. There's, you know, there were people at church that were great. There were people that were, you know, populated the individual classes. There were people that I got along with, but I felt as though I had, you know, a secret tattoo or, you know, the shared same DNA with the people that were in the drama department.
I want to ask you about another passion that you developed in your childhood. You just released a book, a great book of short stories called Uncommon Type. There is a story in that book called The Past is Important to Us,
oh, yeah.
which is a great, great book about time travel. But it struck me just thinking about your career and your story that the past is important to you, that you are very focused on history. And you know, you're very focused on the history of World War II, the history of the 60s. What attracted you to that? When did you start down that road?
When I started reading for pleasure, I don't know if it's proper to say this, but I had a very vivid imagination in all other respects of school pursuit. I was in the theater. I was quote unquote an actor. That is a lot of making things up that have to be rooted somehow in a concrete reality. So I read nonfiction because it really happened. I read a lot of biographies and autobiographies because that was better than anything that you could possibly make up. I lived in a in a fiction world, a make-believe world, and so I was not profoundly moved by an awful lot of novels unless they were set in some brand of concrete reality, and that's always been my interest in reading, because I believe, and I have seen over and over again, is that vanity of vanity, all is vanity, nothing new is under the sun. Human behavior has demonstrated itself in a cyclical manner in the form of history, and when you're not involved in the nostalgia of a period, but in the human behavior of a period, it all folds right into what you and I are going through today.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Well, first of all, what about that World War II experience, generation? You know, I remember, we're about the same age. I remember when John F. Kennedy came to a little housing development where I grew up in New York to campaign in 1960. I was a little boy. And thinking back at it, this was a housing development for returning war veterans. And everyone there had just experienced this, of everyone coming together to repel fascism, defend democracy. And there was a sense that anything was possible, that you could overcome any obstacle. And I assume that's part of what attracts you to that generation.
There was a paradox that I was aware of from a very early age, is that there were two versions of the war. One was the movie war, the TV war, that ongoing mythic celebration of what the myth was, with the right kind of music and the right kind of triumph and maps and stuff like that. But then there was the other one that was displayed by every single caregiver, every adult that was in my world, which was, they talked about the war in very personal terms. When they talked about life before the war, their lives were simple. Their lives were also dangerous because you died of pneumonia before World War II. You could have a tooth abscess that could kill you. And when they say, well, you know, of course, that was before the war, because during the war was this huge cranial shift of their vision of the world, how big it was, how tight it was, and the forces that were out there that effectively altered their daily lives. And then after the war, of course, it was like, we're here and we share that burden with so many other people. There's no reason to talk about it too much because everybody speaks the same common language.
And yet it did create a sense of community in that was one common element that sort of brought everybody from all parts of the country together.
My dad had skills that he never would have had because of the war. He became a machinist, so he learned hydraulics and stuff like that. But he also had that grander world vision of places that where he go and sites that he had seen.
Your work, not just your acting work, but your documentary work, some of the stories in this book sort of capture, it's almost in sepia tones, that generation, that era. How does it compare to where we are today? You said earlier that there are lessons that you can draw from history.
Well, there are times, I think, when we have a national consciousness of permanence, and other times of great transience, where we feel as though there are times of, hey, things are going good, and all of our institutions are working according to the contract that we have with them, and our popular culture is reflecting back to us a contentment and a sense of accomplishment. Certainly in the early 1960s, that was an awful lot of what was on TV and was in the movies, and the nature of what we heard in all of popular culture. And right now, that I think the consensus is that those social contracts have all been broken, that we are often lied to, that we are often kept from knowledge, and then there's a reason to be outraged, and there is a reason to be afraid, and there's a reason to look at outsiders as an upsetting of a status quo that really wasn't working for us in the first place. And a lot of that comes from signals that are sent to us by, I think, organizations or institutions with an agenda. I think that we are in a period where that brand of transience it's scary. I mean, it's like Springsteen says, there's a darkness on the edge of town, you know. At the same time, you want to have an understanding of we take care of our own, but there is a type of well, I think that we're more afraid right now, and I'm not sure that we know what we're afraid of.
Coming up next on The Axe Files.
We are not the United States of America without the First Amendment. It's monkeying around with our Constitution.
One of the institutions that people relied on when we were kids and for some time was the news media to deliver those facts. The Fourth Estate, exactly.
From a guy who is a lay historian who does it, Daniel Moynihan had this great saying, which was, "You are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." And that's not true anymore. Everybody has their own facts, and they cling to them. And sometimes they're insane conspiracy theories, but other times there are interpretations of people's motives, and other times it's like 2 times 2 equals 4. There's not an accountant in the world that doesn't understand 2 times 2 does in fact equal 4. That's a fact. But as soon as you apply that to a measure of ozone in the air or a loss of ice in the polar ice, well, suddenly those facts, 2 times 2 doesn't equal 4 anymore. It means there's something else. You can question literally the math.
You just completed a film that's going to be released later this month called The Post, about the Washington Post, and a particular episode in its storied history that went to the publication of the Pentagon Papers, secret papers that revealed what was going on inside the government, and in many cases things that were hidden from the American people about judgments that were made. It was very very controversial.
Steven Spielberg directed it, and it's really the story of how Kay Graham came to be Kay Graham, and it just happened to all...
Publisher of the
Washington Post, as well as Newsweek and television stations, and it all just happened to occur in the same week. And in order to be not just the figurehead, but also the owner and the publisher and the person who made the decisions, Katharine Graham had to decide whether or not to print stories about the Pentagon Papers.
Perhaps on the threat of imprisonment.
Right. The New York Times, who had already run these huge stories on it, was shut down, in fact. Yeah. They were enjoined from publishing anymore by the government, by the Justice Department. They were shut down by agents of the President of the United States. So the assault on the First Amendment was pretty basic. And you had a President of the United States who was trying to shut down, literally trying to keep from publishing.
Richard Nixon.
Richard Nixon was. And that's what tyrants do. That's what crappy communist dictators do, in the smaller countries on the other side. That's what banana republic dictators do. They shut down the newspapers. They keep them from printing, whatever stories it is. I think it's interesting, David, because the questions, as we go on and talk about this movie, it's all about fake news.
Right. This movie, what is your hope? What is Steven Spielberg's hope?
I can't speak for Steven. He's the boss.
Yes. Well, I'll take yours.
Okay. The point that it takes is that we are not the United States of America without the First Amendment.
So it is a current issue, as you know.
Oh, well, it's right.
Because
Because
the president has targeted news organizations that have printed things that he finds inconvenient,
I believe he calls CNN fake news.
He did indeed, and the Washington Post.
And the Washington Post.
And other news organizations as well. How much does that concern you?
Well, as an American, it concerns me because it's monkeying around with our Constitution. It's relatively obvious, I think, is what is trying to go for it. When you tear down these institutions to a level of say you can't believe anything that is in any of them, that raises the stock of those agenda-filled other institutions or whatnot, so that if you can't believe them, well, that means you get to believe some of the other stuff that is in these. And so what is happening is a dilution of the great. They're throwing dirt and oil into a bucket of water, so it all becomes undrinkable after a while. And when conspiracy theorists ends up having the same amount of purchase as 27, reporters who are trying to get to the bottom of some records that exist somewhere, trying to determine what was said about Vietnam in 1956 and 1947 and 1963. Well, then you're monkeying around with, I think, what the United States of America has been based upon, which is the great freedom to say what you want, assemble with who you want to, and read and be informed by those people that you want to turn to. I think what the current administration is doing, I don't know that they're saying we have to shut them down so they don't publish anymore. What is happening is something that is more subtle and more insidious, and I think has more fingerprints from other governments in the past who have said, look, we can't shut them down because that will cause outrage, but we can denigrate them. We can call them names. We can tell people that those are not the facts. That's what he's saying.
You were criticized by some back at the beginning of the administration. I think I shared your view when you said I'm not rooting for the president to fail.
Yeah.
And I thought back to at the beginning of the Obama administration, when I was in the administration, Rush Limbaugh said, I'm rooting for the president to fail. And I thought particularly at a time of national emergency, that was a terrible thing to say. And so I felt you owe the next president that same presumption. We're now 10 months in. Where do you think, how would you evaluate him?
Well, when we were back in the golden months of last October, before the election, people stick microphones in your face and you think Donald Trump's going to get elected? And I said, I was one of the kids. Says, no way, you don't elect a guy like that president of the United States. And I thought that all the way up, and I said something, glib or flip, something like, well, if that's going to happen, well, you know what? Then aliens are going to land on my front lawn, and dinosaurs are going to wear capes. It was a silly answer for something that was impossible. But
Have you checked your lawn lately?
Well, if I had said instead, if that happens, neo-Nazis are going to hold torchlight parades in Charlottesville, and Pocahontas jokes will be said in front of the Navajo code talkers.
Although we have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas.
That would have been just as hellacious in imagination, I think, as what we have.
It's ironic to me because if not for The Apprentice and that vehicle that he had, he likely wouldn't be president of the United States today. And yet, he also benefits from the disapprobation of the media, of the entertainment industry, I should say, Hollywood. I watched the Emmys, and it was a real beatdown on Donald Trump. And my thought was, boy, this probably helps him with his support.
Oh, it does. I think so, because at the end of the day, it's dogpiling. It's a degree of cheap shots. I will say, I think we have to admit this, though. Something profound came out of that election, and that is the rules were smashed. The rules no longer applied. A candidate could say outrageous things and not be penalized by when it came down to the voting booth. And you can look at it as though some aspect of it, there was a national referendum that had enough of this ongoing political continuum that was always say the right things, always feed your base, always say just glittering generalities about anybody, because you don't want to offend. And that is translated, I think, to you don't want to tell the truth about what your opinions are. Here's a guy that you can't stop telling his
no one ever says, I wish he'd speak his mind.
And what could come out of that? Well, what could come out of that is that on whatever other side of the political divide, you'll start hearing people speak their minds. And unfortunately, it seems as though the only people who have done that so far are folks who are no longer running for office.
You've talked about yourself as a lay historian here, because there is a sense of unsettlement, of unease about where we are, in the sense that, we've crossed some Rubicon and we can't get back.
In all of the history that I've read, and all of the the various all the various things that I have tried to turn into nonfiction entertainment, you do come back to this other thing, which is the power of our immediate foundation. John, some of this began because when I was doing Philadelphia.
Yes.
In Philadelphia, and so I'm walking around trying to get skinny because we're playing somebody who's suffering from the great pandemic of our age. We visited Independence Hall. Which is a great place to be. It's in the middle of the city. You go, the Liberty Bell, there it is. And the park ranger, the guy in literally the green uniform, the Smokey Bear hat, he said, and on that spot there, literally the physical spot, John Adams was sworn in as the second president of the United States. And for the first time in recorded human history, rule of a nation changed hands without bloodshed or death. And my head exploded because I hadn't put it together that way. The great thing about our democracy is not us putting people into power. It's taking people out of power. But in America, we've done it again and again and again and again.
Yeah, which I think we take for granted.
We do, because even right now, it's like, there's an impeachment thing that's going around there.
Yeah, what do you think about that?
I'd say we have something better in store than that. We have an election coming up in less than a year now. Yeah. 2018 is going to send a message that is going to reverberate much more than any Senate hearings or congressional stuff that's going to go by. That election in 2018 is going to prove one of two things. We will continue along and we will have the government we deserve, Or a lot of people are going to show up and be motivated to vote in order to send out the waves and say, we are not satisfied with the way things are going right now. So if there is a turnout that says we're not satisfied with this, hey, baby, that's even better than going through the machinations.
Well, the other thing, and I've said this, is I think
hey,
impeachment is a tool that should be used very carefully, because if it becomes commonplace to say, I dislike who's in office, so we're just going to impeach them. And I understand there are provocations, but there is a system in place. There are people who are investigating things. They will either lead to something or they won't. But if it becomes a casual tool, I think it's bad. It's bad for the country in the long run. And it's one more institution that will be abused, you know.
Well, if crimes have been committed, yeah, I get it. But, you know,
right.
We don't have to. It's a marathon. There's a longer faith that we can have, and everything goes in spurts. You know, stops and starts. Sometimes you take one step forward, 2 steps back, but other times you take 1 step back and 2 steps forward, and that means you just keep moving forward a little bit.
Next on the Axe Files.
I hope the victims come out and tell all sorts of stories, everything, tell the truth about what goes on, and that the repercussions land exactly as they should.
I have to ask you that about investigative reporting, because it's also shining a bright light in the corners of other corridors of power, and Hollywood has come under that scrutiny. Mm-hmm. You've seen some real giants of your industry, Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and others, who have been I guess exposed is the wrong word, but who have been identified as sexual harassers, sexual abusers, or at least there are allegations of that.
Allegations. Call them
allegations, predators,
yeah.
predators. How pervasive is that in the industry itself, and how complicit is everyone who has been around it all these years and not said anything about it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, anybody who had like very specific knowledge of what was going on, they'll have to answer questions about, you know, how complicit were they.
I mean, you saw a lot of stars, people who you've acted with.
Rightly so.
Yeah, but they came forward after these very brave women who were not prominent and who were not powerful told their stories to the New York Times, told them to Ronan Farrow in the New Yorker.
Yeah. I think there's a number of reasons people go into this line of work that I'm in, essentially trying to come up with stories that people will pay to see. One is because it's just ridiculous amounts of fun. Two is, if you can make it stick, it can be a pretty good living, you know, and you get to travel the world and see interesting things. Some people do it for power. They just want to have a degree of power because that's the thing that gives them credence. It's something, you know, on one hand, it's a parking space with your name on it, and to take it to another extreme, it's the ability to beat up on underlings and say things like, so you want a job? You want to keep your job? Well, then you're going to have to fulfill these other demands I have on you that are of a sexual nature. That is pure harassment. It's you know, to the degree of assault. There are people like that, without a doubt, in Hollywood. I don't think it is as it's not common core, but without a doubt, it's widespread. Because human nature comes down to, a lot of times those people in power have it for that that ability, that access, in order to be a sexual predator.
Well, we've seen it in politics.
Well, it's everywhere.
Seen it in business.
But you know, part of it also goes like, look, we are, in a lot of ways, we all left town and joined the circus, and the circus is glamorous in a lot of ways, and. There is camaraderie, and there is sex, and there's attraction, and there's boyfriends and girlfriends, and there's flirting, and that's always been part of it. There's on-set affairs. There's no law against that.
But this goes far beyond.
This goes much farther beyond that, because it ends up being a swaying of influence, and it becomes part of the marketplace. It becomes, when it is inherent into the workforce that you join, that you have to succumb to a degree of sexual harassment in order to keep your job. When that happens, the only thing you can say is, number one, I hope the victims come out and tell all sorts of stories, everything, tell the truth about what goes on, and that the repercussions land exactly as they should.
First of all, were you surprised by some of these revelations?
I'm surprised by the overtness of it. Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. Am I surprised at some of the personalities involved? Not Harvey. Mm-hmm. You know, he had a way of doing business and, you know, a zero-sum game, negotiation stuff that would not make you surprised to have him be one of those kind of guys that does that in the workplace. Others are just like, well, there's a time and place for decorum and ethics, and you blew it. You know, there's that as well.
Do you think that there'll be scripts written about this, about these women who lived in terror, or will Hollywood protect itself from that?
Oh no, I think there's going to be quite a bit that's going to come out about it. And here's what's going to be an interesting test: is that going to be salacious, titillating, shocking, outrageous in order to draw viewers? Or is it going to be human and realistic and authentic in its details in order to say what happened? In some ways, you can already see, you know, I'm sure there's already stories in development that are going to be based on the Harvey Weinstein or whatever. And is that going to be as, what's the word I'm looking for? Is that going to be as pure an examination of the theme as somebody else taking along and saying, well, let's fictionalize it and turn it into something so that we're not necessarily dealing with the specifics of any one person, but can get down to the specifics of what it really did to the human beings involved.
Do you think films like that, or let's talk about Philadelphia, which was a brave film in 1993, do you think they have the power to change things? Do you think Philadelphia hastened an understanding of age?
I think it did, both in what it accomplished and what it failed to accomplish. The throwing deep in the end zone on Philadelphia was that it was going to compete in the open marketplace. You can make a small movie for $400,000, and you can play in every film festival in the world, and only 62,000 people will see it. It will be a profoundly good movie to them. But when you're going out and you're going to compete in your local marketplace for a broad audience to come in and deal with something that is kind of ripped right out of today's headlines, you have to do it in a manner that it's going to be somehow so approachable, authentic, and glamorous in order to attract an audience who simply wants to be entertained. If they become entertained at the same time, good for you. But there's throughout all of American history, and which I have said, a gentleman's agreement with Gregory Peck in 1952 was about anti-Semitism that no one had ever touched before. The Best Years of Our Lives was about the emptiness that an entire generation faced when they came back from the war. And how in the world do they get on with that? You can go The Grapes of Wrath. I mean, even though the ending was absolutely nothing like John Steinbeck wrote, it ended up being entering into the national consciousness and changing that consciousness, because you could not argue with the theme that it was examining. And Hollywood will do that all the time. It won't always land on it. It won't always make it happen. It might cop out periodically, but there's always going to be something coming down the pike that is meant to do it. The difference now is it might be on, you might be on a streaming service as opposed to playing in your local cinema, because the superheroes are filling up all the cinemas.
Coming up next.
Could you play this president of the United States?
Oh, I think a lot of people could. Yeah.
How would you play him? You've probably seen the stuff written and said about, well, why don't we run Tom Hanks for president?
Yeah, well, that's
How would you like to play that role?
I don't even want to play the president of the United States, much less be the president of the United States.
Could you play this president of the United States?
Oh, I think a lot of people could. Yeah.
How would you play him?
I would probably play him as a very incurious man. And I do it in interpretation more so, than incurious and an unimaginative guy who who doesn't see much beyond the next 48 hours. Here, let's come this way. Can you get a shot of this? Do you know what this is?
It looks to be a television set.
Not just any television set. This is a communist television set. This was on the set of Bridge of Spies. Never make a movie with Steven Spielberg and said, hey man, this is a good, yeah, look at this little communist TV. That looks like it's a lot of fun. Next thing you know, it's being delivered to your house. So this was, you know, you could make your own records on tape, and you could have, you know, look at this old microphone, some old headphones.
This is quite a rig.
No, this was a big deal. I didn't even know this stuff was in here. I'm discovering it right now. Shall we put this on and see what this says? Maybe we should.
It could be crucial. So you mentioned Bridge of Spies. You've done so many of these sort of historical pieces, biopics. Are you drawn to those? Do you find those?
Only when they're mysterious and create something brand new, and when there is a dynamic to the character that I think speaks greater than the nostalgia for the period.
Ben Bradley, you know, these people are known. I mean, Ben Bradley hasn't been gone that long. Mm-hmm. A lot of people know him. A lot of people worked for him, with him. He was an icon of Washington, pillar of Washington. Does it make it harder when people know these people? I mean, does it put more pressure on you?
It is a pressure, but we set out in order to obey a couple of rules. Like I played Richard Phillips, who was kidnapped by Somali pirates.
Captain Phillips.
Yes, and Sully Sullenberger and Charlie Wilson, the congressman when he was alive. And then you have a meeting with them, and you have to say to them, look, in this movie, I'm going to say things you never said and do things you never did, and I'm going to be places you never were. Despite those handicaps, I wanted to be as realistic as possible. If you're aiming out in order to not alter the motivations of anybody or to a ridiculous degree for the sake of dramatic purposes, the order of events, well, then you can live up to, I think, the truth of is if you're making a movie about something that really happened for good or for bad, it becomes a document. It becomes a version of events that people will turn to as being an authoritative source of this moment of history. And you can't play fast and loose with that reality. You actually have to adhere as close as you can to the facts.
You illustrate your book with photos, I presume, of some of these typewriters.
It's not the first typewriter you get that's important. It's the second typewriter that determines you're a collector. Because if you buy a typewriter you don't need because you already have a typewriter, what does that say about you?
How many do you have now?
Oh, come on, sure.
All right.
These are all various stages of they kind of work, they don't work, they need servicing, they're too big, whatever. These have all been edited. I have gone through the whole collection. I pulled out every one. I made sure they work. They're all in working order.
And do you use them?
Yeah, I rotate them. I rotate them into use, and I can tell them by the cases. There's some Smith Coronas. This will be a Selectomatic. There's some more Hermes.
So tell me, I mean, you already asserted that it is some reflection of insanity, but what is it about these that cause you to collect them?
This machine tells the truth, and it also tells lies. It can change the world for the good or the better. Listen to that. See that? See that? Hear that report? Now, the only thing you can do on this is record your thoughts. That's the only thing that it's good for. It's the only thing that it's meant for. But if you're going to say, I love you to somebody, it's as permanent as though it was going to be carved in stone.
So many of your projects are sort of these sepia tone memories of another time, and it seems to me these are as well. You have a fondness for an era. You have a fondness for a time.
I think I have a fondness for a limited technology that was closed-ended. You know, a clock was meant to do only one thing, tell you the time. A camera did one thing, it took a photograph of you. Listen, I am as much as enmeshed in my iPhone as much as possible, but of late, I removed every game from it. I've taken off every news update service of it. I've gotten rid of all sorts of stuff that sends me information that I just check as opposed to read.
Yeah.
And it's actually made my life a little bit more cohesive.
Ahead on the Axe Files.
I got to tell you, there's times I've lied through my teeth. And sometimes in promoting movies that even I knew weren't even good.
I will say that polling has gotten a bad rap. So I tell you this advisedly, but you know, every poll I look at says Tom Hanks is the most trusted. Tom Hanks is the most beloved and popular actor. So,
isn't that right, guys? Give me a big huzzah! Huzzah!
So you must be.
They're not allowed to say.
You've made that connection for a very long time, and that's an enormous accomplishment.
Well, I don't discount that. I don't. That says something. That is, this is the way I take it. Is that my countenance, if I should be so bold, matches my choices. You know, I think that's when you get to this point where you realize you're a bit of a commodity, and I realize I am, you know, from a business perspective, and the people who want me to do business with them, I understand I'm bringing into it the sum of everything I've ever done, everything I've ever said, any reaction any audience has ever had. And
so probably don't screw it up now.
One, don't screw it up, but at the same time, you must stretch it somehow, because otherwise all you are is a bottle of Coca-Cola.
Right.
You need to provide some other brand of nourishment and healthiness. And so if those kind of very flattering polls, if people say, they say, what better thing could you hear about yourself other than, hey, I trust you?
Yes.
That's about the highest praise you could get from anybody. And I got to tell you, there's times I've lied through my teeth. Sometimes in promoting movies that even I knew weren't any good. But you can still get into an understanding of sometimes you take a shot, sometimes you don't. But, you know, countenance matching up with the quality of the choices you make, man, outside of longevity, that's the only standard you can hold yourself to.
Well, Tom Hanks, it's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm exhausted, David. Have I pontificated enough?
We're gonna give you a rest. No, it's really so good to be with you, and I appreciate
thank you.
your time.
I enjoyed talking to you.
To hear more of my conversation with Tom Hanks, go to itunes.com/axfiles.